Tonight, we descend into the darkest corridors of the ancient world. We stand at the gates of Rome, not the Rome of marble temples and triumphant arches, but the Rome of blood-soaked sand and screaming crowds. This is the story of an empire built on brutality, where entertainment meant watching humans torn apart by wild animals, where emperors tortured senators for sport, and where crucifixion was so common that the roads leading into major cities were lined with crosses bearing the dying and the dead. Before we begin this journey through humanity's capacity for cruelty, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're re-watching from and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes these stories keep you awake, and other times they shape the nightmares that follow. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for tales that history tried to forget. The foundation of fear, ancient Rome stands in our collective memory as a pinnacle of civilization. We remember the roads that connected continents, the aqueducts that brought water to millions, the legal systems that influenced nations for millennia to come. We celebrate the Pax Romana, that golden age of relative peace that stretched across the Mediterranean world. But beneath this veneer of civilization lurked something far more disturbing, a society that had refined cruelty into an art form, that had transformed public execution into mass entertainment, and that considered human suffering not merely acceptable but necessary for the maintenance of order and the pleasure of the masses. To understand the horrors of Rome, we must first understand that Roman society operated on fundamentally different principles than our own. Life held different value depending on where you stood in the rigid social hierarchy. At the top, the patricians, the old noble families who traced their lineage back to Rome's founding. Below them, the plebeians, free Roman citizens, with rights but limited power. Further down, the freedmen, former slaves who had gained their liberty but carried the permanent stain of their previous status. And at the very bottom, comprising perhaps 1/3 of Rome's population at its height, the slaves, human property with no legal rights whatsoever, whose lives could be ended on a whim by their owners. This stratification meant that justice itself was stratified. A Roman citizen could not legally be crucified. That humiliating death was reserved for slaves and enemies of the state. A senator might be exiled for crimes that would see a commoner fed to wild animals. The same act could result in a fine, a flogging, or a horrific public execution, depending entirely on who committed it and who witnessed it. This was not hypocrisy in Roman eyes. It was the natural order of things, as fundamental as the rising sun. The Romans were not unique in practicing capital punishment or even in enjoying spectacles. What made Rome different, what made Rome exceptional in the annals of human cruelty, was scale and systematization. Other cultures might execute criminals. Rome turned execution into theater. Other societies might punish rebels harshly. Rome created an industry around public suffering. The amphitheaters that dotted the empire were not merely arenas for gladiatorial combat, they were stages for state-sponsored murder. Temples where the twin gods of justice and entertainment demanded blood sacrifice measured in thousands. But perhaps most disturbing was how normalized this violence became. A Roman citizen could wake up on a Tuesday morning, handle some business in the forum, grab lunch from a street vendor, then settle into his seat at the Colosseum to watch men being torn apart by lions while he digested his meal. Children grew up understanding that convicted criminals would be crucified along the roads. Slaves knew that if their master was murdered, every slave in the household would be executed regardless of their involvement or innocence. This was not seen as barbaric. It was simply Roman. The sources we have for these horrors come primarily from Roman writers themselves. Tacitus, that stern chronicler of imperial excess, documented the persecutions and cruelties with a historian's precision. Suetonius, in his biographies of the emperors, spared no detail in describing their depravities. Seneca the Younger, that stoic philosopher who served as Nero's advisor, wrote with disgust about the midday executions he witnessed at the games. These were not Christian propagandists, exaggerating Roman brutality. These were Romans documenting what they themselves had seen and experienced. What follows is not for the faint of heart. These are not myths or legends embellished over centuries of retelling. These are documented historical events, practices confirmed by multiple sources, archaeological evidence, and the testimony of those who lived through Rome's darkest hours. Some of what you'll hear may seem impossible, too cruel for human beings to inflict upon one another. But that is precisely the point. To understand history, We must confront not only the nobility of which humanity is capable, but also the depths to which we can descend. The arena, where death became entertainment, the Flavian amphitheater, known to history as the Colosseum, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. Imagine that for a moment. 80,000 people, roughly the population of a modern mid-sized city, gathering in one place for a single purpose: to watch other human beings die. The games followed a predictable schedule. Morning brought the Venatians, the animal hunts, where trained fighters called venators would battle exotic beasts brought from the far corners of the empire. Lions from North Africa, bears from Germania, tigers from the east, crocodiles from Egypt. These were not sporting contests. The animals were deliberately starved and enraged. The fighters, while skilled, knew that injury and death were not possibilities but probabilities. The crowds loved it, the exotic nature of the beasts, the spray of blood on white sand, the roar of a dying lion, or the scream of a gourd hunter. But the morning show was merely an appetizer. Around noon, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the exposed sand, came an intermission of sorts. The gladiators had not yet appeared. The serious betting on warrior combat had not yet begun. This was when the condemned were brought out to die. They called it damnatio, ad bestia's condemnation to the beasts. The Latin phrase barely hints at the horror it described. These were not quick executions. They were prolonged theatrical productions designed to extract maximum suffering while maintaining the crowd's interest. The condemned might be slaves who had struck their masters, army deserters, captured rebels, Christians refusing to sacrifice to the emperor, common criminals guilty of theft or murder. Their crimes mattered less than the spectacle of their deaths. The procedure varied, each variation calibrated to prolong the agony while preventing the crowd from becoming bored. In one version, the condemned was given a weapon, typically a spear, and told to defend himself. He was pushed into the arena, often naked or wearing only a simple tunic. Then the beast was released. It might be a lion, hungry and confused by the noise of the crowd. It might be a bear, massive and aggressive. Sometimes multiple animals were used in sequence. The condemned man, untrained in combat, wielding an unfamiliar weapon, would attempt to fend off a predator that outweighed him and had been deliberately starved to increase its aggression. If by some miracle he managed to wound or even kill the first animal, another would be released immediately, and another, and another. The crowd kept meticulous count, cheering each animal released, placing bets on how long the condemned would last, how many beasts he might wound before being brought down. When the inevitable happened, when teeth found throat or claws, opened belly, the crowds would roar their approval. The lucky died quickly, a lion's jaws crushing the windpipe, a bear's paw shattering the skull. The unlucky were mauled, their screams adding to the cacophony as they were literally torn apart while still conscious. The sand of the arena, kept white through constant raking, would turn red. Slaves with hooks would drag away the corpses when the animals had finished, making room for the next condemned man and the next beast. But that was the version reserved for those the state deemed deserving of a fighting chance, however slim. For the truly despised, for political enemies, and persecuted minorities, there was an even worse fate. These victims were not armed. They were not given even the pretense of a chance. They were simply exposed to the beasts. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, unable to run or even turn away from the approaching predator. Sometimes they were dressed in animal skins, the scent and appearance supposedly exciting the beasts into more vigorous attacks. Christian martyrs were reportedly sewn into the skins of wild animals before being thrown to the dogs, the symbolism lost on neither the executioners nor the victims. The Roman poet Martial described one such execution. A criminal named Laurealus, who was hung on a real cross and then offered to a Caledonian bear. The bear, Martial wrote with what seems like satisfaction, tore at Laurealus's entrails while the man still lived, his body dripping blood but clinging to life even as his organs were pulled free. The playwright Seneca the Younger, serving as Nero's advisor, attended these midday executions once and was so disturbed he wrote about them years later. His account is one of the few we have from someone who recognized the horror for what it was. He describes arriving at the games hoping for some wit or humor, some relief from the brutality of the morning hunts. Instead, he found pure murder, no helmets, no shields, no skill, just men being killed in the most painful ways possible, for the amusement of tens of thousands. Seneca watched as condemned men were forced to kill each other. The survivor of each bout was not freed, but immediately paired with another condemned man. This continued until all were dead. Between these forced combats, men were thrown to wild animals with no weapons, no protection, no hope. Seneca, no soft-hearted moralist but a stoic philosopher who believed in accepting fate with equanimity, was shocked, not by the deaths themselves, death was part of life, but by the corruption of the spectators. The crowd, he noted, became infected by the cruelty they witnessed. They laughed at suffering. They cheered for more creative deaths. They complained when a man died too quickly, robbing them of their entertainment. What made all this worse was that innocence provided no protection. The Roman judicial system, such as it was for the lower classes, made no provisions for careful investigation or fair trials. A slave accused by his master faced no real defense. A Christian identified by a neighbor had no recourse. The arena became a destination for the falsely accused, as surely as for the genuinely guilty. Cicero himself wrote with indignation about a man thrown to the beasts, merely because he was considered ugly, his supposed crime being nothing more than his appearance offending those in power. The Emperor Caligula, during a period when meat prices had risen, ordered that prisoners be fed to the circus animals with no discrimination as to their crimes. This was not punishment. It was livestock management. The empire had to feed its exotic beasts, and prisoners were cheaper than cattle. But the Romans, ever inventive, found ways to make even these basic executions more elaborate. They developed what might be called mythological executions, where the condemned were forced to reenact scenes from legend and mythology, scenes that invariably ended in the protagonist's death. A man might be dressed as Hercules, given the hero's signature club, and dressed in a tunic. But this tunic had been soaked in pitch, at the climax of the performance, matching Hercules' self-immolation before his ascension to Olympus. The condemned Hercules would be set on fire and burned to death before the crowd. Another might play Orpheus, recognizable by the lyre he carried. The arena would be transformed into a woodland scene, filled with animals both predatory and prey. In the myth, Orpheus charmed all creatures with his music. In the arena, when the signal was given, the predators were released, and the unprotected Orpheus was torn apart, his lyre providing no protection against tooth and claw. These mythological reenactments served multiple purposes. They displayed the wealth and creativity of whoever sponsored the games. The elaborate sets and exotic animals were expensive. They demonstrated knowledge of classical culture, showing that the sponsors were educated in Greek mythology, and they added an extra layer of humiliation to the condemned, forced to play act in a perverse drama, where everyone knew the ending would be their own genuine death. The scale of this slaughter is difficult to comprehend. At the inaugural games of the Colosseum in AD 80, celebrating the amphitheater's completion, the festivities lasted 100 days. Ancient sources claim that 9,000 animals were killed during this period. 9,000. And while the sources don't specify how many humans died, the sheer number of condemned criminals, war prisoners, and religious minorities who perished in those 100 days likely ran into the thousands. This was not an aberration. This was normal. This was entertainment. And it happened not just in Rome, but in amphitheaters across the empire. Every major city had its arena. Every arena needed its condemned. The system fed itself, creating an insatiable demand for victims that the Roman legal apparatus was more than willing to supply. Nero, the emperor who turned humans into torches in the year 64 AD, Rome burned. The Great Fire started on the night of July 18th in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds, it raged for 6 days, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Tens of thousands were left homeless. Ancient temples, irreplaceable texts, and countless works of art were consumed by flames. When the fire finally died, Rome was devastated. Rumors immediately began circulating about who had started the fire. Some whispered that Emperor Nero himself had ordered it, wanting to clear space for his grandiose building projects. Others said he had simply watched the city burn while reciting poetry about the fall of Troy, playing his lyre as his capital was consumed. Whether or not Nero actually started the fire remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is what he did next. Needing a scapegoat, facing a population angry and homeless, Nero turned his attention to a small, relatively unknown religious sect that had been growing in Rome's shadows. The Christians, they were perfect targets. They refused to worship the Roman gods or offer sacrifice to the emperor. They spoke of a coming apocalypse when the world would be destroyed by fire. They practiced what seemed like bizarre rituals, speaking of consuming flesh and blood. Most importantly, they were few in number and universally distrusted by the pagan majority. The historian Tacitus, no friend to Christianity but also no admirer of Nero, documented what happened next with a precision that makes it all the more chilling. First, Nero had prominent Christians arrested and tortured until they provided names of other Christians. This created a growing list of victims. Then the mass arrests began. Tacitus describes it as a huge multitude, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Men, women, and children were rounded up across the city. What followed was not mere execution but deliberately theatrical torture designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. Some Christians were sewn into the skins of wild animals and thrown 2 packs of hunting dogs. The dogs, trained to pursue and kill wildlife, attacked the skin-covered victims with savage efficiency. The screaming of the victims mingled with the snarling of the dogs and the roar of the crowd as people were literally torn apart. Others were crucified. This alone would have been a horrible death. Crucifixion typically took days, with the victim dying slowly from asphyxiation, exposure, and shock. But for Nero, simple crucifixion was not enough. He needed a more spectacular demonstration. And so was born what history would remember as perhaps the most horrific execution method ever devised: the human torch. The process was methodical. The condemned Christian would be tied or nailed to a tall wooden stake driven into the ground in Nero's private gardens. Their bodies would then be coated with pitch, tar, oil, wax, and other flammable materials. These substances were applied liberally, ensuring that once lit, the victim would burn for as long as possible. The key was to start the fire at the feet, allowing the flames to slowly work their way up the body. Why start at the feet? Because a fire started at the head would kill relatively quickly as the brain was damaged by heat and smoke inhalation. But a fire started at the feet would burn through flesh and muscles slowly, the victim remaining conscious through unimaginable agony as they literally watched their own body consumed by flames. The pitch would bubble and hiss. The smell of burning flesh would fill the gardens, and the screaming would go on until the flames finally reached vital organs or the victim's lungs filled with smoke. Tacitus, recording these events some 50 years later, noted that Nero used these human torches to illuminate his garden parties. As night fell over Rome and darkness descended on the imperial gardens, Nero would order the Christians to be lit, one by one. They would be set ablaze, their burning bodies providing light for the emperor and his guests to see by. Nero himself would mingle with the crowd, dressed as a charioteer, enjoying the spectacle of his own creation. The Roman candle, as this method of execution became known, represented a particularly twisted Roman innovation. It combined execution with utility. The condemned did not simply die. They served a purpose, providing illumination while they screamed. It transformed human beings into objects, into mere fuel for light and entertainment. Among the Christians who perished in Nero's persecution were 2 of the most important figures in early Christianity. The apostles Peter and Paul. Both had come to Rome to spread their faith. Both would die for it. Peter, according to Christian tradition, was crucified. As a non-citizen, he had no protection from this humiliating death, but the tradition holds that he made one final request: to be crucified upside down. He claimed he was unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus Christ. Whether this actually happened or became a legend later is unclear, but it speaks to the nature of crucifixion in Rome. The method was flexible. Victims might be nailed or tied. They might face forward or be turned around. They might hang right side up or inverted. Each variation altered how long the death took and how much the victim suffered. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had certain legal protections that even Nero could not entirely ignore. Roman citizens could not legally be crucified, so Paul was beheaded, a quicker and less painful death, though certainly not a pleasant one. The executioner's sword would end his life in a single blow rather than the days of agony crucifixion entailed. But Peter and Paul, prominent as they were, represented only 2 deaths among hundreds, possibly thousands. Tacitus, writing decades later, acknowledged that while Christians were guilty of hatred of humanity in the eyes of Romans, the sheer cruelty of their punishment began to generate sympathy. Even pagans who despised Christianity started to feel that the executions were excessive, motivated not by justice or the public good, but by the emperor's personal cruelty. And Nero's cruelty extended far beyond Christians. Suetonius and other historians documented a reign characterized by increasingly bizarre and sadistic behavior. He would tie the genitals of men drinking wine at his banquets, preventing them from urinating, then laugh as they squirmed in agony. He had a senator's throat slit, and when the man somehow survived, Nero ordered his eyes gouged out and then had the senator's internal organs removed with hot pincers before finally having him cut in half. This was Rome's emperor for 14 years, not a barbarian conqueror or a foreign tyrant, but a man born into the highest echelons of Roman society, educated by the best tutors, advised by philosophers like Seneca. His reign demonstrated something fundamental about the Roman system. Absolute power, combined with a culture that accepted extreme violence, created conditions where the most sadistic impulses could be indulged without meaningful restraint. The human torches, the crucifixions, the feeding of victims to wild dogs, all of this happened not in some dark dungeon but in public, witnessed by thousands, accepted as the emperor's prerogative. This was justice in Nero's Rome. This was entertainment. This was normal. Caligula, when madness wore a crown, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus. The name sounds noble, connecting him to Julius Caesar himself and to his father Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved military heroes. But history remembers him by a nickname he acquired as a child, Caligula, meaning little boots, from the miniature soldier's boots he wore while accompanying his father on military campaigns. Caligula became emperor in AD 37 at age 24. The Roman people celebrated, after the paranoid later years of Tiberius, who had retreated to the island of Capri and ruled through a network of informers and executioners. Caligula seemed like a fresh start. Young, descended from beloved Germanicus, he promised a return to better times. For the first few months, he recalled exiles. He staged spectacular games. He distributed money to the people. Ancient sources describe him as generous, fair, and community-spirited. Then something changed. Some historians point to a serious illness Caligula suffered in AD 38, possibly a life-threatening fever that may have affected his mental state. Others argue his character never truly changed, that the early months were merely political theater while it consolidated power, and his true nature emerged once he felt secure. Regardless of the cause, by the second year of his reign, Caligula had become something Rome had never quite seen before, an emperor who seemed to actively delight in cruelty. The torture methods attributed to Caligula were not random acts of violence, but calculated exercises in inflicting maximum psychological and physical suffering. Suetonius documented many of them in his biography of the emperors, writing roughly 80 years after Caligula's death, but drawing on sources much closer to the events. One of Caligula's favorite techniques involved prolonging death through intermittent torture. Rather than execute someone quickly, he would order that they be beaten with chains, but slowly, with breaks between beatings. The victim would be given time to recover partially before the beating resumed. This could go on for hours or even days, the condemned never knowing when the next blow would fall, unable to lose consciousness or find the mercy of a quick death. Another method involved cutting out a victim's tongue before having them thrown to wild beasts. The practical reason was to prevent them from speaking out against the emperor during their final moments. But there was a psychological dimension as well. Unable to scream coherently, their final sounds reduced to guttural moans, they were dehumanized even further in the moments before death. Caligula particularly enjoyed watching executions while he ate. He would order torture and execution to take place during his meals, the screams of the dying serving as background entertainment while he consumed elaborate courses. Guests at his table would be forced to watch as well, their appetite for food competing with their revulsion at the spectacle. He was known to glory openly in his power over life and death. He would boast that he could have anyone executed with a simple nod of his head, and he would demonstrate this power regularly, sometimes ordering executions for the most trivial reasons. A man with particularly fine hair might be shaved bald on the spot, simply because Caligula envied his appearance. Someone who showed too much confidence might be cut down to prevent them from becoming a rival. His sexual depravity became legendary. He would sleep with the wives of his officials and senators, then publicly brag about their performance in bed, comparing them while their humiliated husbands sat in his presence. He allegedly had incestuous relationships with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he seemed to genuinely love. When she died in AD 38, he had her declared a goddess, the first mortal woman in Roman history to be deified. His grief seemed genuine, but it did nothing to temper his cruelty toward others. One incident, recorded by Suetonius, perfectly captures Caligula's mindset. A gladiatorial show was being held, and the price of meat had risen, making it expensive to feed the condemned prisoners who would be executed at the games. Caligula's solution was simple and chilling. He had the prison guards parade the prisoners before him. Then, without examining records of their crimes or inquiring about guilt or innocence, he simply walked down the line, pointing at men at random. From that bald head to that one there, he would say, and every man between. Those two markers would be thrown to the beasts. Their crimes were irrelevant. The guilt or innocence meant nothing. They were simply meat to feed the animals, and Caligula was missimizing. He also allegedly attempted to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. While some historians believe this was meant as a joke or a way to mock the Senate, others suggest he was serious. The horse lived in a marble stable, had a jeweled collar, and was served meals on golden dishes. Whether Caligula truly intended to give political power to a horse, or was simply humiliating the Senate by suggesting his horse was their equal, the message was clear. Traditional Roman institutions meant nothing to him. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated steadily. He would force senators to run alongside his chariot in their formal robes, laughing as they stumbled and fell. He removed consulships and granted them to others without Senate approval, making clear that their august's body existed only at his pleasure. He demanded they address him as a living god, something even the most megalomaniacal earlier emperors had avoided. Religious persecution intensified under his reign. He was particularly hostile toward Jews, viewing their monotheism as a rejection of his divinity. He threatened to place his statue in the Temple of Jerusalem, an act that would have sparked a massive rebellion. Only his assassination prevented this from happening. The specifics of individual executions under Caligula often seemed designed to maximize psychological torture. A senator might be brought before the emperor expecting execution, only to be warmly greeted and sent home. Then, days later, when he had allowed himself to hope, the executioners would arrive, or a man might watch his sons executed one by one, forced to maintain composure before being killed himself. The uncertainty, the false hope, the prolonged dread, these were as much weapons as the sword or the cross. After 4 years of this terror, a group of conspirators, led by officers of the Praetorian Guard who had endured countless humiliations, assassinated Caligula in a tunnel beneath the imperial palace. They stabbed him multiple times, making sure he was truly dead. Then they hunted down his wife Caesonia and murdered her. Most horrifying, they found Caligula's infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, and smashed her head against a wall, determined to end his bloodline completely. The Roman people's reaction to his death was notably muted. No mass mourning, no calls for vengeance, just a collective sigh of relief. The mad emperor was dead, and Rome could try to return to something resembling normalcy. But Caligula's reign left a mark. It demonstrated that the Roman system had no effective check on an emperor determined to abuse his power. The Senate was neutered. The Praetorian Guard could assassinate an emperor, but only after years of enduring his cruelty. The people had no recourse at all. This was the fundamental flaw in the Principate. When a good man became emperor, Rome flourished. When a monster wore the crown, Rome suffered, and there was no constitutional mechanism to remove him short of murder. The torturer's toolbox, methods of suffering. Beyond the arena and the whims of mad emperors, Rome had developed an extensive catalogue of execution and torture methods. These were not improvisations, but established procedures, techniques passed down and refined over generations. Each had its purpose, its intended victim, and its calculated level of suffering. Consider the punishment of the sac-ponacule. This was reserved for the crime of parricide, the killing of one's father or another close family member. The Romans considered this one of the worst possible crimes, a violation of the sacred bonds of family and the natural hierarchy that placed fathers above children. The punishment reflected this horror. The condemned would be stripped and placed in a large leather sack, along with a series of animals: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Each animal had symbolic significance. The dog represented shamelessness. The rooster signified an unnatural attitude toward one's parents. The snake embodied a venomous nature. The monkey suggested base humanity. Once the condemned and the animals were sealed inside, the sack would be thrown into a river or the sea. Imagine the terror. Trapped in darkness, with 4 frightened, aggressive animals. The viper, venomous and hostile, striking at anything it could reach. The dog and monkey, confused and panicking, biting and clawing. The rooster pecking and scratching, and all the while, the sack is filling with water as it sinks. Death might come from drowning, from venom, from wounds inflicted by the animals, or from shock. The method ensured that the final moments would be filled with pain, fear, and the appropriate symbolism of dying in the company of base creatures. The earliest recorded instance of this punishment dates to around 100 BC, though some sources suggest it existed earlier. Emperor Justinian's legal codes, written in AD 530, still included detailed instructions for ponocale, showing how long this practice persisted in Roman jurisprudence. Another horrific method involved using the corpse of an animal as an instrument of slow death. A donkey would be killed and its belly sliced open, the entrails removed. The condemned would be stripped naked and forced inside the animal's hollow carcass. The body cavity would then be sewn shut, leaving only the victim's head protruding, preventing suffocation but ensuring they remained trapped. The donkey's body, with the living person inside, would be left in the sun. As the hours passed, the animal's corpse would begin to decompose. The heat from the sun would cook the person trapped inside. Maggots would appear, crawling over the rotting flesh of the donkey and onto the living person. Vultures, attracted by the smell of decay, would begin tearing at the dead animal, sometimes reaching the living person within. The process could take days, each hour bringing new horrors as decomposition advanced and the victim remained conscious, able to smell their own spendings, feel the squirming of maggots, and hear the tearing beaks of carrion birds. This method appeared in ancient texts, including Apuleius S., the Golden Ass, and Lucian S., Lucius, or the Ass, suggesting it was known, if not common, during the height of the Roman Empire. The sheer creativity of the cruelty, using decomposition itself as a torture tool, speaks to the Roman capacity for finding new ways to inflict suffering. For crimes requiring a quicker, but still painful death, there was the method of heated cauldrons with animals. A small metal cauldron would be placed upside down on the victim's exposed abdomen. Inside the cauldron, a live animal would be trapped, often a rat, mouse, or cat. The executioner would then heat the cauldron from above, using flames or hot coals. As the metal grew hot, the animal inside would panic, desperate to escape the increasing temperature. The only soft surface available for it to dig through was the victim's belly. The animal would claw and bite frantically, tearing through skin and muscle, burrowing into the victim's abdomen while they screamed. Death came eventually from shock, blood loss, or infection, but not before the victim experienced the unique horror of feeling an animal eating its way through their body. This method required no special equipment beyond what any torture chamber might have available. Its simplicity made it practical. Its effectiveness at extracting confessions or punishing made it popular among interrogators. Then there was the bee basket torture. The condemned would be stripped naked and placed inside a large, loosely woven basket. This basket would be hoisted into a tree known to contain a large, active beehive. The disturbance of hoisting the basket would agitate the bees, who would swarm through the gaps in the weaving to attack the helpless victim. Thousands of bee stings delivered over minutes or hours. For those allergic, death might come relatively quickly from anaphylactic shock. For those without such allergies, death would be slow, the result of toxic venom accumulating in the blood, swelling blocking airways, or simply shock from the overwhelming pain of countless simultaneous stings. The victim couldn't escape, couldn't swat away the attacking insects, could only endure as their body was transformed into a mass of welts and their breathing became more labored. Molten metal execution represented another category of cruelty. The condemned might be forced to swallow molten gold or lead. The psychological dimension was often significant, particularly when gold was used. If someone had been condemned for avarice or theft, forcing them to swallow the liquid gold they had craved, added a symbolic dimension to their death. The physical reality was pure horror. The superheated metal would sear the mouth, throat, and esophagus instantly. The heat and steam produced would cause internal organs to burst. Blood would boil. The victim would be unable to scream coherently as their mouth and throat were destroyed. Death came relatively quickly compared to some methods, but the final seconds or minutes were filled with the unique agony of internal burning. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthy Roman general who would later suppress Spartacus's rebellion, was himself reportedly killed this way. After his defeat and capture by the Parthians, legend holds that molten gold was poured down his throat as a mockery of his legendary greed. Whether this actually happened or was propaganda created by his enemies is uncertain, but the fact that such a death was considered plausible speaks to Roman familiarity with the method. Flaying, the removal of skin while the victim remained alive, was perhaps the most purely agonizing method in the Roman catalogue. The victim would be restrained completely, unable to move head, limbs, or torso. The executioner would begin peeling away the skin using a sharp blade, often starting with the face. Why the face? Because it maximized psychological torture. The victim could still see, at least initially, as their own skin was pulled away in strips. The face had an enormous concentration of nerve endings, making it extraordinarily painful, and it meant that if the victim somehow survived or was shown to others during the process, their appearance would be maximally horrifying. The process was slow by necessity. Remove the skin too quickly, and the victim might bleed out before experiencing the full extent of the suffering. Sometimes executioners would boil parts of the body first, making the skin easier to remove and prolonging the victim's consciousness. The pain of flaying was considered nearly unbearable. Nerve endings exposed directly to air and touch as layers of protective dermis were stripped away. Ancient sources suggest this method was used primarily on captured enemy leaders or those guilty of particularly heinous crimes. The myth of Marsyas, the satyr who challenged Apollo to a music contest and was flayed for his hubris, made the punishment symbolically resonant in Roman culture. Artistic depictions of Marsyas's flaying appeared in various Roman artworks, suggesting the Romans found nothing particularly unusual about the practice. Crucifixion, so common it barely needs detailed description, nevertheless contained variations that increased suffering. The standard method involved nailing or tying the victim to a cross, shape, structure, and leaving them to die slowly over hours or days. But Roman executioners developed multiple variations. The victim might be nailed to the cross, right side up, or inverted. They might be attached to a T-shaped cross, an X-shaped cross, or a simple vertical pole. They might have a small wooden support for their feet, which actually prolonged death by allowing them to push up and breathe more easily, extending their agony. Or their legs might be broken, causing them to suffocate more quickly as they could no longer push themselves up to inhale. Sometimes a victim would be crucified with the cross driven through their genital region rather than being nailed to it, adding sexual humiliation and additional agony to the execution. Sometimes they would face forward, sometimes backward. Sometimes they would be crucified high in the air for maximum visibility, sometimes close to the ground so wild dogs or other scavengers could reach them while they still lived. The cruelty of crucifixion lay not in any single aspect, but in the combination: public humiliation, prolonged suffering, the victim's complicity in their own death as they chose between the agony of breathing and the agony of suffocation, the exposure to elements and insects, the knowledge that help would not come. And in Rome, crucifixion was so common that roads leading into major cities were lined with crosses. During Spartacus's rebellion, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, one cross every 40 yards for over 100 miles. The sight of thousands of men dying simultaneously, their screams echoing across the countryside, their bodies rotting on the crosses for weeks as a warning to others. This was Roman justice. Decimation, when Rome turned on its own. The Roman military machine was legendary. Disciplined, trained, equipped with superior tactics and technology, Roman legions conquered most of the known world, but this effectiveness came at a cost. A level of discipline so harsh that it sometimes consumed the soldiers it was meant to perfect. The most extreme form of military punishment was decimatio. Decimation. The very word has entered our language, though its modern meaning as simple destruction barely hints at the original practice's calculated cruelty. In the Roman military context, Decimation meant something very specific, the execution of every 10th man in a unit that had failed in battle or committed collective crimes like mutiny or mass desertion. The procedure was ritualistic, almost ceremonial in its precision. When a commander decided a unit deserved decimation, the soldiers would be assembled. They would be divided into groups of 10. In each group, lots would be drawn. This might involve pulling straws of different lengths from a container, drawing stones from a bag where 9 were painted white and 1 left unpainted, or some other random selection method. The man who drew the short straw or unpainted stone would be separated from his group. Then came the execution, but this was not carried out by professional executioners or by soldiers from other units. The 9 remaining men in the group were ordered to beat their chosen comrade to death using clubs or stones. They were forced to kill their own fellow soldier, someone they had trained with, fought besides, perhaps shared a tent with for years. Think about what this meant psychologically. These men were brothers in arms. They depended on each other for survival in battle. They had formed bonds that in many ways exceeded family connections. Now they were being ordered to murder one of their own, and if they refused, they themselves would be executed. So, they raised their clubs, they brought down the stones, and they beat their friend to death while he screamed and begged. The first well-documented instance of decimation occurred in 72 BC during the Third Servile War. The slave rebellion led by Spartacus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, given command of the Roman forces after previous commanders had failed, faced legions demoralized by defeats. When a unit of 500 men fled from battle rather than engage Spartacus's forces, Crassus revived the ancient punishment of decimation, which had fallen out of use for over a century. 50 men were selected by lot. Their former comrades beat them to death. But Crassus wasn't finished. The remaining 450 survivors were expelled from the main camp for several days, forced to bivouac outside the fortifications where they were vulnerable to attack. They were put on half rations, and their wheat was replaced with barley, a grain typically fed to animals rather than men. This additional humiliation drove home the message: they were less than soldiers, less even than citizens. They had failed Rome, and they would be treated as cattle until they could prove themselves worthy again. The ancient historian Appian claimed that Crassus decimated entire legions, suggesting perhaps 4,000 men killed. Modern historians largely reject these numbers as exaggerations. The more conservative estimate of 50 men from a single cohort seems more plausible. But even 50 executions in this manner would have had an enormous psychological impact on the entire army. And it worked, at least in the short term. Crassus's legions, terrified of their own commander, perhaps more than they feared Spartacus, fought with desperate courage in subsequent battles. They eventually defeated the slave army, and 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. The message was clear: fear your commander more than you fear the enemy, and Rome will be victorious under their hands. They could never fully trust that the man standing next to them in battle wouldn't have been the one to beat them to death if lots had fallen differently. This was Roman discipline taken to its logical extreme, not just punishing failure, but making the punishment itself a tool for cohesion through shared trauma. It revealed something fundamental about Roman military philosophy. The unit mattered more than the individual. Loyalty to Rome trumped loyalty to comrades, and survival was a privilege that had to be continuously earned through perfect obedience and battlefield success. The systematic cruelty of slavery. Slavery formed the foundation of Roman society. Estimates suggest that at the height of the empire, slaves comprised approximately 30 to 40% of Italy's population. These were not people born into slavery and accepting it as their natural state. Many were captured in war, their cities conquered, their families killed or scattered. Others were sold into bondage by impoverished parents or enslaved as punishment for crimes or debts. All lost their humanity in the eyes of the law. A slave was not a person but a thing, an object, with no rights, no legal standing, no protection against their owner's whims. They could be beaten, killed, sexually abused, or sold without any recourse. And in perhaps the cruelest twist, the law actively mandated the torture of slaves in certain circumstances. Roman legal procedure held that a slave's testimony was inherently unreliable unless extracted under torture. If a crime had been committed and slaves might have witnessed it, they would be tortured until they provided information, regardless of whether they actually knew anything. The assumption was that slaves would lie to protect themselves or their masters, and only pain would force truth from them. This created horrific situations. A wealthy Roman might be accused of a crime. Rather than face torture himself, which was illegal for Roman citizens, he could demand that his slaves be tortured in his place. These slaves, who might know nothing about the alleged crime, would be subjected to increasingly severe torment until they either died or provided testimony that satisfied the interrogators. Whether their eventual statements were true, or simply what the slaves believed their torturers wanted to hear, was irrelevant. The law had been followed. The forms of torture used on slaves were limited only by the imagination and resources of those conducting the interrogation. Flogging was common, though not with simple whips. Roman whips often had metal tips, pieces of bone, or sharpened fragments of pottery woven into the leather. A skilled interrogator could flay skin from muscle with each strike, while ensuring the victim remained conscious. The rack was another favorite. The victim stretched until joints dislocated and ligaments tore. Hot irons applied to sensitive flesh, crushing devices for fingers and toes, suspension from the ceiling in uncomfortable positions for hours or days. The catalogue of torture implements was extensive and constantly being refined. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of slavery's cruelty was its casual nature. A slave owner could beat a slave to death for breaking a dish and face no legal consequences. Pliny the Elder recounted dinner parties where slaves who made mistakes would be whipped while the guests continued eating, the sounds of leather on flesh and the slave's screams serving as background ambience. One particularly notorious incident involved Lucius Pedonius Secundus, the urban prefect of Rome, who was murdered by one of his slaves in 61 AD under Roman law. When a slave killed his master, every slave living under the same roof would be executed regardless of their involvement or knowledge of the crime. The logic was that slaves should police each other, should inform on anyone plotting violence, and the threat of collective punishment would enforce this. In Pedonius's household, there were 400 slaves, men, women, and children. Most had nothing to do with his murder. Most probably didn't even know it was planned. But the law was clear. All 400 would be crucified. The Roman public, hardened as they were to violence, found this excessive. Crowds gathered to protest. How could it be just to kill innocent children for a crime they could not have prevented? How did executing hundreds serve justice when only one was guilty? The Senate debated. Some senators argued for mercy, suggesting that the law should be modified for cases where obvious innocence could be proven. But Gaius Cassius Longinus, a respected senator and legal scholar, argued for strict application of the law. He acknowledged that innocent people would die, but argued that terror was necessary to keep the vast slave population under control. If slaves knew that any murder of a master would result in mass execution of everyone in the household, they would inform on potential conspirators to save themselves. Mercy in this case, he argued, would weaken the deterrent effect and endanger all slave owners. The Senate voted to uphold the law. All 400 slaves, from the elderly to young children, were marched through the streets of Rome. The public protests grew so intense that the emperor had to deploy soldiers to keep order, but the law was executed. 400 crosses were erected outside the city walls. 400 people were nailed or tied to those crosses. Over the following days, they died, their screams echoing across Rome as a reminder of the price of being born into bondage. This was not an isolated incident. The law remained in force. Similar mass executions occurred whenever a slave killed their master, though rarely on such a large scale, simply because most households didn't contain 400 slaves. But a household of 20 or 30 slaves was common among the wealthy, and all would die for one man's crime. The sexual exploitation of slaves was also systematic and accepted. Male and female slaves were routinely raped by their owners. Beautiful young slaves commanded high prices specifically because of their sexual appeal. Slave women could be forced into prostitution, their earnings going to their masters. Slave men might be castrated to serve as eunuchs in wealthy households. Children born to slave mothers were automatically slaves, regardless of who fathered them. A master could rape his slave, and the resulting child would be his property to do with as he pleased. This created situations where masters owned their own children and could sell them, abuse them, or kill them with no legal consequences. The gladiatorial schools Ludi purchased slaves specifically to train them for death in the arena. Young men with physical potential would be bought, branded, and subjected to brutal training regimens designed to make them effective fighters. Many died in training. Those who survived their training would fight in the arena, where most would eventually be killed. A successful gladiator might earn enough prize money to eventually purchase his freedom, but this was rare. Most died within a few years of entering the arena. Household slaves lived in constant fear of their master's moods. A slave who displeased his owner might be sent to work in the mines. A death sentence delivered slowly through exhaustion, starvation, and cavern, or they might be sold to an amphitheater to be executed in the lunchtime shows, or simply beaten to death in the privacy of the master's home, their body disposed of with no more ceremony than one might show a dead animal. This was the foundation on which Rome built its civilization. The marble temples, the aqueducts, the roads, the literature, and philosophy, all rested on the backs of millions of enslaved people whose lives were measured in their usefulness and whose deaths meant nothing. The Tarpeian Rock, where traitors fell on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill in Rome, one of the city's 7 hills, and location of important temples. There was a cliff called the Tarpeian Rock. It stood approximately 80 feet high, though exact measurements varied depending on which ancient source one consulted. From its summit, one could see the Roman Forum clearly, that center of Roman political and social life. But the Tarpeian Rock's significance lay not in its view, but in what happened there. This was Rome's execution site for traitors, murderers who killed through betrayal, and others whose crimes particularly offended Roman sensibilities. The method was simple, brutally so. The condemned would be brought to the summit. Then they would be thrown off, their bodies broken on the rocks below. The cliff's name came from legend. Tarpeia was supposedly a Vestal virgin, one of the sacred priestesses of Vesta who was sworn to chastity and service to the goddess. Her father, Spurius Tarpeus, commanded the Roman garrison when the Sabians besieged Rome in the 8th century BC. Tarpeia, according to the legend, was bribed by the Sabine general Titus Tatius, who promised her what the Sabines wore on their left arms, meaning their gold bracelets and rings. She opened the gates and betrayed her city. But Titus Tatius, disgusted by her treachery, allegedly ordered his men to throw not just their jewelry, but their shields onto her, crushing her to death under the weight. Then her body was hurled from the cliff that would bear her name. Whether this story is historical or mythological hardly matters. Romans believed it, and it gave the execution site a symbolism that went beyond simple killing. To be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock was to die the death of a traitor, to be marked forever as someone who betrayed the trust of Rome. It was humiliating in a way that crucifixion or execution in the arena was not, because it specifically linked the condemned to Tarpeia's betrayal. The practical reality of the execution was that the fall itself might not kill immediately. 80 feet provided enough distance that victims would likely suffer serious injuries. Broken bones certainly, possibly a fractured skull or severed spine, but death was not guaranteed. Some victims might survive the fall, lying broken at the base of the cliff. Ancient sources don't specify what happened in such cases. Were they left to die slowly from their injuries? Was someone sent to finish them off? The sources are silent, leaving us to imagine the horror of surviving the fall, only to lie broken and bleeding while waiting for death. The categories of people thrown from the rock expanded over time. Initially reserved for traitors and those who violated sacred oaths, it came to include common murderers, particularly slaves who killed their masters, and those who committed what Rome considered crimes against the state. The definition of treason was flexible in Rome, particularly during the imperial period when criticizing the emperor could be construed as treasonous. The location itself added to the punishment's symbolism. The Capitoline Hill was sacred, home to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the most important temple in Rome. To be executed there, literally cast down from a sacred space, emphasized the religious dimension of the criminal's offense. They had not merely broken laws, they had offended the gods. The Tarpeian Rock remained in use for centuries. References to executions there appear in texts from the Republic through the Empire. Its prominence in Roman consciousness was such that later Roman writers would use "thrown from the Tarpeian Rock" as a literary shorthand for the execution of traitors, even when describing events that took place far from Rome when no such cliff existed. Archaeological investigations of the Capitoline Hill have tried to identify the exact location of the Tarpeian Rock. The current cliffs don't match ancient descriptions perfectly. partly because the landscape has changed over 2,000 years, and partly because ancient sources provide conflicting details. But the general location is known, and modern visitors to Rome can stand near where the rock would have been and look down at the Forum below, imagining the condemned taking their final steps before the fall. The slow fade of Roman cruelty by the 4th century AD, something was changing in the Roman world. The systematic cruelties that had defined Roman entertainment and justice for centuries began to decline. This shift had multiple causes, none of them simple or singular. Christianity played a significant role. As the new religion spread through the empire, its teachings about the inherent worth of all humans, the importance of mercy, and the prohibition on murder began to influence even non-Christians. The early Christian martyrs, dying in amphitheaters across the empire, had inadvertently created a public relations crisis for the Roman state. Their willingness to die rather than renounce their faith, their forgiveness of their executioners, their serenity in the face of horrific deaths, all of this made an impression. The stories of martyrdom became tools for conversion. Hearing about Christians torn apart by wild animals, yet forgiving their persecutors, watching them face crucifixion, singing hymns, witnessing their refusal to curse their tormentors even as they burned. This challenged Roman assumptions about strength and weakness, about honor and shame. If these Christians could maintain their dignity and faith even in death, if their religion gave them strength to endure what seemed perhaps there was something to this new religion after all. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, and later made it the empire's official religion, the institutional basis for much of Rome's cruelty began to erode. Christian emperors, advised by church officials, began limiting and then banning some of the worst practices. The feeding of criminals to wild animals in amphitheaters was outlawed. Crucifixion was eventually banned. Gladiatorial games, while they persisted for several more decades, lost their official sponsorship and gradually faded. But Christianity was not the only factor. Rome was also declining militarily and economically. The empire could no longer sustain the vast infrastructure required for the games. Capturing and transporting exotic animals from Africa and Asia was expensive. Training gladiators required significant investment. Building and maintaining amphitheaters demanded resources the empire increasingly lacked. As Rome fragmented and barbarian invasions increased, money and attention were diverted from entertainment to simple survival. The wild animal hunts had also created an ecological disaster. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of animals were killed over the centuries of the games. Hippos disappeared from the Nile. Lions were hunted to extinction in Mesopotamia. The North African elephant, the aurochs, the European wild horse, the great auk, and the Eurasian lynx were all wiped out entirely, driven to extinction by Rome's insatiable appetite for exotic beasts to kill in its arenas. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the last Venetians, animal hunts, were being held. The great amphitheaters fell into disrepair. The Colosseum itself was damaged by earthquakes and pillaged for building materials. What had once been the center of Roman public life became a ruin, a reminder of a past, both glorious and terrible. The execution methods, however, persisted longer than the games. Crucifixion might be banned, but hanging remained. Burning at the stake replaced burning in the arena. Beheading by sword continued for those of high status. The state's power to execute its citizens didn't disappear, it simply changed form. The spectacle was removed, but the death remained. Medieval and early modern Europe would develop its own torture methods and execution spectacles. The breaking wheel, drawing and quartering, the stake, all these would echo Rome's creativity and cruelty. Perhaps the Romans hadn't invented systematic torture and public execution, but they had perfected it, refined it, made it a central part of their culture for over 1,000 years. The memory that haunts when we study Roman history, we face a paradox. This was a civilization that gave us representative government, the rule of law, incredible engineering, sophisticated literature, and philosophical insights that still resonate today. The words, I'm speaking now, the language in which this script is written, derives from Latin. Our calendar, many of our legal concepts, architectural styles, military organization, all bear Rome's fingerprints. But Rome was also this: the crucifixions and the human torches, the mass executions and the torture chambers, the systematic dehumanization of slaves, and the casual acceptance of suffering as entertainment. We cannot separate the civilization from the cruelty. They were not contradictions but two aspects of the same society, woven together so thoroughly that one enabled the other. The question that haunts us is whether this was unique to Rome, or whether it reveals something universal about human nature, when unchecked power meets cultural acceptance of violence. Rome did not invent cruelty. Earlier civilizations had their own horrors, but Rome industrialized it, systematized it, built vast infrastructure to support it, and maintained it for over a millennium. The Christian martyrs whose deaths we discussed earlier would triumph in the end, not through military conquest but through the very stories of their suffering. Their martyrdoms, documented and retold, became the foundation for Christianity's spread through the empire. The arena that was meant to destroy them instead made them saints. The emperors who persecuted them are remembered as monsters. The religion they died for became the dominant faith of Europe for over 1,000 years. This is perhaps the final irony. Nero's human torches, meant to terrorize Christians into abandoning their faith, instead created martyrs whose stories converted others. The amphitheater executions, designed to show the powerlessness of those who challenged Rome, demonstrated instead that there were things worth dying for. The cruelty intended to maintain order eventually contributed to the transformation of that order into something very different. But we should not make the mistake of believing that cruelty died with Rome. The methods changed, the justifications evolved, but human capacity for inflicting suffering on other humans did not disappear when the last Roman emperor fell. It simply found new expressions in new centuries under new banners. What studying Roman cruelty teaches us is not that they were uniquely evil, but that any society can normalize horror if it serves the interests of those in power, and if the culture accepts certain classes of people as less than fully human. The slave who could be tortured to extract testimony, the criminal who could be thrown to wild animals for entertainment, the Christian who could be burned as a torch, all existed in a framework where their suffering was considered acceptable, even necessary. The lesson, if there is one, is vigilance. Vigilance against the dehumanization of any group. Vigilance against the normalization of cruelty. Vigilance against systems that give unchecked power to those who might abuse it. Rome fell, but the tendencies that made its horrors possible remain part of human nature, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge again. Closing thoughts. We have journeyed through some of the darkest chapters of Roman history. We have witnessed cruelty refined into spectacle, torture transformed into entertainment, and human life rendered worthless in the machinery of empire. These were not myths or exaggerations, but documented historical realities, confirmed by multiple sources and supported by archaeological evidence. The amphitheaters, where tens of thousands died, can still be visited today. The Colosseum stands in Rome, a monument to both human architectural achievement and human capacity for cruelty. The roads where 6,000 crucifixes once lined the Appian Way still exist, though the crosses and the screaming are long gone. The very ground of Rome is built on the bones of countless victims of these practices. If these stories have disturbed you, good. They should. If they have made you grateful to live in a time and place where such systematic cruelty is no longer socially acceptable, better still. If they have made you think about how societies rationalize atrocity and how quickly the unthinkable can become routine, then perhaps this journey through Rome's nightmares has served a purpose beyond simple historical education. Remember to like this video if you found it informative, however dark the subject matter. Subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's hidden and haunting corners. And in the comments, let us know what aspect of Roman cruelty you found most disturbing, and whether there are other historical topics you'd like us to explore in future videos. The lights can come back on now. The modern world awaits. But remember what we've learned about the past, for the past is never truly past. It lives in our institutions, our assumptions, and our capacity for both nobility and horror. Rome reminds us of both. Sleep well, if you can. And remember that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the darkness that lurks in every human heart, waiting for permission to emerge. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may history inform your present and guide your